global pandemic,
To balance the budget.
healthcare costs, housing, 830G. Have you met President Trump? I'm just curious.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
Arav is an amazing interviewer, very energetic, gets a lot of information out of folks. Tune in and make a difference here. It's a great podcast.
Thank you, Governor. Hello and what's up, political peeps? Per usual, I'm your host, Arav Kapoor, and today I'm at the Fairfield First Selectperson's office here in downtown Fairfield. Across from me, Connecticut's Governor Ned Lamont.
Rob, you got great energy.
I really appreciate it. We were just talking about energy and, what young people can bring to politics and stuff is so important. So I appreciate you, being here to talk to me, to support me, and, answer some questions about your career, Connecticut government, all that stuff. First, of course, I want to say thank you to Christine Vitale, Fairfield First Select Person, and her staff for giving us this space, and then your team for organizing this and making this episode happen.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right. So you obviously distinguished political and educational career. You went to Yale and Harvard. What kind of competition is that? Which one did you like better?
Oh, they're all my children. You want to know? Mm-hmm. Who's in Connecticut? That ought to answer that question for you.
I shouldn't have asked.
I'm a homer.
Right. And then you worked in journalism, all that kind of thing.
I thought I was going to be doing what you're doing. I started a weekly newspaper right out of college. I loved being a newspaper person, observing, writing, explaining to people. I was in a little town called Ludlow, Vermont. It was going through bad times. General Electric had just left. There was a big hole in the middle of the town. And so I covered it for almost 2 years, how this town got back on its feet. And then, ironically, when I started running for governor, it was right after GE had left Connecticut. GE had left Fairfield. And so I felt like life was repeating itself, how we get the state back.
Yeah, and you also went to digital media. How does it feel to be on the other side of that, now that I'm interviewing you?
Well, the digital media thing is, most guys do politics their whole lives. Don't do that. Get a little experience in something else, not for profit. I started up a business, and it was in the digital media space, like you said. We wired up about 400 college campuses, so it took me all over the country installing telecommunications systems for colleges. Did a bunch here in Connecticut, so UConn, University of Hartford, some Yale.
Important work. Then you got into politics, ran for select person's office in Greenwich. What brought you to the world of politics?
I just always thought you should give back and do something in your community. I had always enjoyed it. That's what I always thought I was going to do. So I was not first selectman. That's a full-time job. I couldn't do a full-time job. I had my other thing, but I was a selectman. And then they wanted me to run for first selectman. I said, sorry, I can't do that. I got another gig. Right. So I went to the Board of Finance, which is really good experience. You have to balance the budget. Mm-hmm. So those are the things that got me sort of involved. I thought that's what I'd always do. And then George W. Bush invaded Iraq, and I got myself energized.
Right. You ran for state senate at one point in there, and then eventually you won the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate in 2006 from Connecticut. You said you were energized by George W. Bush. You lost that race by a little bit against Joe Lieberman, who was running in his own independent party. What did you learn from that race, though? Even though you never went to D.C. as a senator,
no, but
learned a lot being
stand up for what you believe. I looked around, all the usual suspects didn't want to run. I'd done some work in the Middle East with my telecom company. I had some familiarity with what was going on. I thought the invasion of Iraq was as dumb a move this country can make, and now we're doing the same thing in Iran, although I think they'll make sure that's not a 10-year commitment. And I love the opportunity to stand up. A lot of people followed. They didn't know me from Adam. I was just a former selectman. Big deal. And but you believe in what your cause is, and you shouted from the rafters. And we got pretty close. I beat the former candidate for vice president. In the primary. And you want to know something else? Don't burn bridges. Too many people in politics make enemies. I ended up speaking at Joe Lieberman's memorial service. And it said a lot about him that he invited me to speak, and I was proud to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, you didn't have decades of political experience, which is what some people like. Even Senator Blumenthal, he was the Attorney General of Connecticut for decades before running for Senate. Even Senator Murphy, who served in the House of Representatives, state office too. You kind of didn't have those decades of experience. So it says a lot about you that you took the initiative.
Well, it's a different type of experience.
Yeah.
You can do the normal route, state legislator, state senator, maybe a local mayor. I have private sector there's been almost nobody with private sector experience as the chief executive of the state. And it's an executive job, and running a business is an executive job. You've got to, you have to actually balance a budget. You have to get things done. So I think it's a good experience. And for me also, it's sort of a personal thing. I had a wife that was working very hard, so we had to balance that, and I had young kids. So for me, I had a little more control over my life when I was doing the local business and selectmen. But my kids are grown up, so they're happy to see me doing this now.
It's fascinating how much private sector work, carries over to public office. And then you can also sympathize with the people who you're working on behalf, because you were in their shoes not so long ago. In 2010, you tried for the office of governor for the first time, lost the Democratic primary. Daniel Malloy served as governor for 2 terms. Come 2018, Ned Lamont tried again for the office of governor. This time you won by 3.17% against the GOP challenger. And you kind of transitioned. You didn't have decades of experience, just like we were talking about before, into the office of governor. What was that like?
Memo to self: never, ever, ever give up.
Never give
Just if you believe in what you're doing, stand up, dust yourself off, and if you want to run again, run again. And same thing in business. Not everybody's first business succeeds either, but people often respect you for trying. So it's a good memo to follow in life. What was it like? I mean, we inherited a state that was in sort of trouble.
Yeah.
We had been lurching from deficit to deficit to deficit. Like I said before, General Electric had just left. A lot of the cool kids were moving to Boston and New York, and there was just a sense of where was Connecticut going? There was a bit of a cloud over the state. And I feel like people feel more confident about the state. I hope people your age are saying, boy, this is actually more happening here in this state. There's guaranteed job opportunities for people. We've balanced the budget, every year we've been here. And there's a sense, I hope, of momentum. That's what I got to have. I'm a big UConn Huskies fan, but I'm also a Connecticut fan. I hope you are too.
Yes, of course. You spent 2 years working on all these initiatives, then kind of midway through your term, global pandemic, right? This obviously was challenging for everyone who had to govern in an executive position like you, but you get a lot of credit for the proper way that you handled the pandemic for residents of Connecticut. How did you do this? And do you think this contributed to your increased margin winning your second term in 2022?
I think that we managed through COVID because I just sought the advice of the smartest people I could find. And I found a guy named Albert Coe. He's an epidemiologist from Yale. Gave me all the best medical intel I could. A guy named Scott Gottlieb. He was head of the FDA under Trump 1. A Fairfield guy, as a matter of fact. And a woman named Indra Nui from India and head of Pepsi, because I had to get the right balance between keeping people safe and helping to get our government and our business and our state open again. So those are the 3 best people. I was in close contact every morning at 7 o'clock with all the hospitals. And Washington didn't have a clue. We were on our own. And the other thing you realize is there are no borders. COVID, there's no borders. So you learn very quickly. I was every day talking to the governors of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York and New Jersey, because if I did something and they decided to keep all their bars open and ours were closed, all you have is everybody driving back and forth. So we had to work together in a very coordinated way. And we got through it, I think, better than most. We kept more things open. We got our schools open faster than other people. And a lot of people moved to the state of Connecticut. They loved what they saw when they visited.
And you mentioned that, there wasn't a lot of regulation or, consistency coming from the federal level. Specifically, what steps did you take to work with your fellow governors to develop that sense of control for the people of Connecticut?
I said, we're starting to open up our schools now. Maybe you want to do this in parallel so we speak with one voice. You can do it safely because we got more people vaccinated than we had last year at this time. A lot of people are young. We were the first to do restaurants, but we did our restaurants outside for starters. First it was takeout. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And then it was outside dining, and then it was inside. But we were always 6 months ahead of everybody else. But I did it in coordination with the other governors. The toughest thing was getting things like masks and rapid tests. because there Washington had nothing. They pretended they did nothing. So we traveled the globe trying to get the masks for people so they felt safe and were safe. And finally, we got a big shipment of masks from China, of all places, and people cheered when it arrived.
Yeah, and I mentioned this before in 2022, kind of at the tail end of the pandemic drama, you increased your margin of victory in your re-election campaign actually against the same Republican, all the way up to 13.92%. And at the same time, that was a year where federally across the country, there was some backlash against Democrats. So specifically, what in your leadership do you think led to you increasing your margin by that much, even in a year like
I think people got to know me.
Yeah.
They knew who I was. They know how I manage. I listened to folks on both sides. I think we had a pretty good track record. We made good progress there. People liked the fact that we had sort of fixed the budget. People liked the fact that we got through COVID better than most places. And a lot of people were moving back to the state. Yeah, I think that was all positive. Look, people got to get to know you. That's why I said, if you lose your first race, dust yourself off, get back. People want to know who you are. And I think they know who I am.
Yeah, people are familiar with you, and I think that's an advantage in your upcoming, re-election campaign for a third term, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. In the meantime, we're 3/4 of the way through your second term as governor. You're doing a lot of great things, but there's also a few major issues which your administration is working to tackle. One of those being housing, super controversial. A lot of different opinions on different ways we can handle this. There was the original House Bill 5002, which was passed by the legislature. You said it didn't give enough local control and vetoed the bill once it arrived to your desk. Then you called the legislature, the General Assembly, into special session to consider a second housing growth bill, which kind of modified the way we dealt with the 830G statute, which regulates affordable housing in Connecticut. 830G is old legislation or an old statute, but it requires that towns that don't have 10% affordable housing allow developers to bypass their zoning laws to develop in places like Fairfield, where we might not have a moratorium on affordable housing. I gotta ask, since this creates so many issues and we want to return control to town planning and zoning committees instead of developers and people up in Hartford, that's been your goal. You've expressed that to be your goal. Why can't we repeal 830G?
Okay, you got a lot there.
A lot there, right?
A lot there. First of all, you're right. I vetoed the first bill. I wanted a bill that was much more inclusive, and I got a bill that had support of mayors, Republican as well as Democratic mayors and first selectmen. I said, I want you to take the lead. You have a planning and zoning board, but that includes not just zoning. You don't just tell me where you don't want housing. Also, please tell me where you do want housing, and I'll be your partner. I'll be your partner for sewer or water or brownfield remediation. And by the way, Fairfield, you tell us where you want the housing to go. Maybe it's next to the train station or that old parking lot or that half-empty office building. And we'll give you credits against 830G just because you're putting in place a plan that people can act upon. So we're making it easier for towns to take the lead and make a difference. If you want to make some other tweaks to 830G, I'm all ears next year. But that's the biggest change we made. Fairfield, you tell us where you want the housing to go, zone it accordingly, and we'll give you relief on 830G.
Why is affordable housing so important? Why do we need that 10%?
So you can afford to stay in the state and afford your first home. Guys my age, we bought our first home in our late 20s on average. Today it's in your early 40s. People can't afford it. Every business I talk to says the same thing. I'd love to expand my business here or even move my business to Connecticut, but are you sure there's going to be a place for workers to live and young people to live? And I'll tell you that probably 80+ percent, 90% of all the housing we build are in our 15 biggest cities. Our cities like New Haven and Stamford and Waterbury, 50 years ago, they shrunk when manufacturing went overseas. Now they're coming back to life. New London, New Haven, it's extraordinary. And that's good because that's where young people want to be. That's where you get a lot of life and vibrancy and new business startups.
One of the major complaints, though, with this, increase in housing, maybe smaller, denser housing, is that in places like Fairfield, it creates a lot of traffic. There's other repercussions to, such rapid increases in population growth. How do we combat that? Those sort of things.
I will tell you that, for example, Stamford, I've built a lot there, and half the people don't even have a car anymore. It's close to train stations. They have a jitney bus. Everything is walkable, bike paths. That's a good way of the future. And I'm not as familiar with your topography here, but maybe you have an old shopping center that's not doing very well. You turn that into housing, you have less traffic, but more places for people to live.
Yeah, and that ties into something that's a major passion for me, public transportation, and how that can be used instead of everybody driving in their own cars. That helps with the climate. It also helps, people who can't afford a car get better service. So what's your approach for public transportation and tying that into housing?
So thanks to a guy named Joe Biden, we have the biggest infrastructure bill. Every president runs, saying, I'm going to be a builder. He was a builder. And that's allowed us, the state of Connecticut, to rebuild roads, bridges, I-95, 91, 84. We're an old state. We have a lot of old infrastructure. Yes. The rail, like you said, Metro North is 10 minutes slower than it was 50 years ago. Everything else gets faster. So we're getting that done. We're replacing those old bridges, one right down the street in Norwalk. Every bridge you replace, the train can go 2 or 3 minutes faster because they have to slow down over the bridge and then speed up on the backside of it. That's going to make a difference. Yeah. And that'll hopefully get some of those cars off the road too.
Definitely, and that helps climate, that helps, affordability. There's so many different elements. It allows to bring, affordable housing. I had the Metro North president, the president of the railroad, on the show a couple episodes before I sat down with you here, and
he's from Fairfield, is that right?
He's from Darien.
Darien, okay.
I think he lives in West Norwalk, Darien. So I went down to Grand Central and I had a conversation with him, and he echoed the same sentiment that working on the little pieces, increasing service times by 2-3 minutes at a time, that really convinces more people to ride public transportation. And I think that's something really important that your administration has championed.
Yep, and if I can get 10% of those people in cars into that train, it makes an enormous difference for everybody.
On all fronts. Another issue, to transition away from that your administration has done a really great job tackling the deficit. You came in Connecticut, you said there was a cloud over the state. Because obviously we had new deficits every year. Tell me more about how you've tackled that.
Yeah, we had lurched from deficit to deficit to deficit. They kept raising taxes. We did just the opposite. We haven't raised taxes. We balanced the budget. And you know what that brings you? Economic growth. We went from being one of the slow-growing states to one of the fast-growing states. And that expands revenues and opportunities and gives more money for our budget to invest in things like education and housing, like we said before. We've got to keep that momentum going. Fortunately, we've had a pretty strong national economy as well. Gets a little topsy-turvy with President Trump. You never know what you're going to get the next week, but so far, so good.
Yeah, I was talking to the state comptroller a couple months ago, your colleague, fellow Democrat, and we were talking about the 3 different ways that Connecticut's really worked to save more money, develop a rainy day fund. He mentioned a spending cap, a bonding cap, and then the volatility cap. He said we've reached essentially the constitutional limit for how much Connecticut can have in our rainy day fund. But I think you've mentioned this, it ties into healthcare too. There's a point where we reach that rainy day and we can spend that money, because I think ultimately people want to see an approach where instead of their money being used or their tax money being taken and being saved, they want it to be spent on programs that they can use today. So how's your administration approaching that?
Well, anyway, all this stuff about spending caps and stuff.
It's helped save so much money.
It saved us money, but all that means is you can't spend more money than you're bringing in. Basic business, basic local families. And for a long time, we were spending more money than we were generating in terms of tax revenues. And then things would peak, there'd be a little recession, and all hell would break loose, and they raised taxes and cut funding for education. So you're right, that's why I have a rainy day fund. My predecessor, Dan Malloy, he inherited a 0 rainy day fund. In fact, his predecessor had borrowed something like $800 million, put it on the credit card and said, you pay this off if you would. So we've gone the opposite direction. I can't say we can manage a terrible depression, but we can handle a pretty normal recession without having to raise taxes and without having to cut investments in education.
You're talking about healthcare costs a lot. It's in the news. The Trump administration, by Democrats all over the country, has been, accused of slashing healthcare funding, education funding. Are you planning on using some of that rainy day funding to restore, funding that's vital to?
Well, we did a little bit of that already. We have Obamacare, which they call, the exchange here. and President Trump had to pay for the war and some tax cuts. So he said, I'm going to end the subsidies on the exchange. Well, that would have raised premiums, how much you pay for health insurance, by $1,000 or $2,000 a month. So don't give me any lectures about affordability at the same time you're raising people's insurance costs, $1,000 or $2,000 a month. We didn't let that happen. We used some of our rainy day, to help make it affordable on the exchange again. And we have more people on health insurance today than we had before. So that's a big plus. Compare that to other states.
And as we've mentioned a few times, President Trump and what happens in Washington has deep effects in healthcare, housing, really everything that operates in Connecticut, and really has been the elephant in the room of your second term. And for Democrats, since he's taken office in 2025, they've made it their mission to work against him, and they're hoping for big change in the 2026 midterms. As a longtime Democrat, you've worked in politics for 20 years now, on and off. Do you think that it's the right direction for your party to go anti-Trump, anti-Trump, anti-Trump?
Look, I stand up to President Trump where I think he's wrong. He tried to pull the plug on wind power, Revolution Wind. He's trying to make it tougher for people to vote. He sued me a couple days ago because he supports mass deportation and rounding people up, often based upon, the color of their skin. So I stand up where you got to stand up. But the Democrats have got to be for something as well. You just can't be against. So, I'm proud of where we are as a state. I'm proud of the fact that we raised the minimum wage, one of the highest in the country. The Republicans said it's going to trash the economy. Like I said, we got a fast-growing economy. You know what I really love? We made a down payment on universal early childhood education, pre-K for everybody, free of charge up to $100,000 in income. That's going to make a big difference for young families. It saves them money. Make a big difference for your little brother and sister.
Two little sisters.
Two little sisters.
Yes.
They get a running head start in life. Every kindergarten teacher will tell you the same thing. I can tell that kid that comes from a good pre-K program.
This is all, obviously very important. And I think in Connecticut, you're doing a really good job of having goals for your state. You're not about the political show. And I think you've shown your real commitment to the residents of Connecticut. But I don't think all Democrats have done that as well as you have. There's a growing trend of, like you said, people not having a solution. They're just, having a reason to hate Donald Trump. Do you see that being successful for your party? The Democratic Party is slowly becoming more divided, especially at the national level. So what do you think about that going into the 2026?
I say two things.
And then the presidential election in 2028 for your party. What direction will they go? Socialism, like in New York City? Or
first of all, the two extremes in the Republican and Democratic Party, the center is getting smaller and smaller, but that's where you win elections, and that's how you get stuff done. So I really believe that Democrats are going to win because there's a strong sense that Donald Trump has really lost his mooring and taken this country in a way that is unforgivable. And you hear that not just from people in the street in Connecticut, but also our allies and what you see going on around the world. But you got to stand up for what you believe, and it just can't be the antithesis. And, there are a lot of people sit on the sidelines and throw hand grenades. That's just what they do. Yeah. I'll tell you a funny story about Donald Trump, because he was talking to all the governors, and he said, why do all of these U.S. senators, why do they want to be governor? Governor's a tough job. You actually have to do stuff. I'd want to be a senator because then I can just sit around and criticize from the sidelines. He knew what he was talking about, but I also know what he meant.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think senators, right, they're not making decisions on the ground like yourself, right? People's lives are in your hands as governor of Connecticut, whether or not you make healthcare decisions, make other policies.
Two different jobs. I mean, we have great senators. They stand up for Connecticut values. They set federal policy that I get an opportunity to implement. I love that because I get to see on the ground a difference that a lot of their policies are making, or negative policies coming out of the Trump administration, what that means.
Have you met President Trump? I'm just curious.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
What was that like? As a Democrat meeting. When did you meet him?
As a governor, we get together, once a year formally and then informally a little bit along the way. Look, I hate to tell you, he's a very engaging guy. But he can turn on and off like a light switch. He can be funny, engaging, and then the next minute he just flies off the handle. Something triggers him. Fortunately, not at my expense, but I was sitting next to a wonderful lady named Janet Mills about a year ago.
From Maine, right?
from Maine, and all of a sudden the president just went at her like there's no tomorrow.
I saw that clip, right?
Yeah.
At that conference you guys had.
Yeah, you know, she says, "I'll see you in court, Mr. President." He says, "I am the law." I mean, it was really a meaningful interchange. So that's what you have to navigate as a governor. It's one thing if you're a senator or attorney general, you push back. Governors have to navigate to make sure they protect the people in their states.
Yeah. And on the same page, we were talking about, a split in the Democratic Party. You obviously have an important race coming up, 2026. You're running for your third term. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out. There's a Democrat, Josh Elliott, state representative, who's also running on a similar platform toward you. But where do you see the difference between the perspectives between Josh Elliott, who's challenging you for the Democratic ticket, and then yourself? Like, is there a difference?
Well, very different in terms of background. You know, I started a business for the last 7 years. I think we've been strongly progressive. We've gotten things done. Mm-hmm. Look what we did on minimum wage and paid family and medical leave, and universal, health care is our next goal going forward. So, look, campaigns are fun. You can mix it up. That's great. But you got to ask people who's delivered the goods, who's made it happen.
Does he have any policy that's different from you? Anything that sets you two apart besides the obvious, 8 years of experience you have governing Connecticut?
I think he strongly believes that raising taxes, especially raising taxes on millionaires, would make a big difference. I say the last 4 governors have done that, and it slowed up our economy and did not make a difference in people's lives. And so I think that's his calling card, raising those taxes.
Okay, so that's an important perspective, and I'm excited to see how that plays out. How do you think that's going to play out at the Democratic Convention in May?
We'll see. I mean, it's those are a small group of very activists. So it's not a cross section. It's not the broad middle class of Connecticut. It's a different breed of cat. But we'll be there. We'll be there making our case. And if he gets 15%, then on you go to a primary. But what's really important, I think, for both parties is you have a primary, fight on the issues. Don't attack people's character. Don't attack their background. When I had a battle with Joe Lieberman, like I said, we ended up, respecting each other because we had very different points of view on the war in Iraq. Stick to the issues. You'll be okay.
Yeah, that's a really important perspective, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out, and best of luck to you, Governor. Kind of fun question as we wrap up here. You're the governor of Connecticut. All the signs when you're going into on 84, maybe entering Connecticut, it says Ned Lamont Governor, New Haven Pizza. So I gotta ask, where are you getting your New Haven Pizza here in Connecticut? If you have
pizza capital of the world.
Of course, pizza capital.
That's our modest insignia.
But not modest at all, by the way. we have the best pizza. I was at Sally's yesterday, and man, the pie is just the best. But where are you going to get your New Haven Pizza?
I'm not going to tell you.
No way.
There's too many pizza places. I love them all.
Why, you're trying to make sure you retain votes from...
I'm very careful on that. They're all my children.
So you're not going to tell me at all?
Nope.
What kind of pizza are we taking?
Well, I'm a pepperoni guy, that's for sure. No, I'm a simple guy, pepperoni guy. And we got great clams and oysters.
Yeah, definitely.
Go along the shoreline there. It's amazing, especially like the hot sauce.
Political peeps, this was Governor Ned Lamont, who won't tell me his favorite New Haven pizza.
Nope.
But we had a great, comprehensive conversation about his political career, electoral history, what he's done for the state of Connecticut, his upcoming re-election campaign for the 2026 election, his third term. Governor, it was a true pleasure to host you today. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Great interview. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Keep following this guy.